Hi, everybody. This is Diane Jones-Allen again. And today I'm so excited. I'm talking with Hazel Edwards, who is someone I admire. And I also think of her as a friend and just a role model for African-American women. I'm going to read just a little bit of Hazel's bio, just so you can know a little bit about her. But I hope through the discussion, you'll get to know about Hazel and the wonderful things she's doing. So, Hazel Ruth Edwards has been professor and chair of the Department of Architecture, College of Engineering and Architecture at Howard University since July 2016. Dr. Edwards' unique career has combined place-based research with planning and urban design practice. Her research interests in livability are framed within urban contexts while focused primarily on historic campus environments. Of note is a planning study that culminated in a book that she co-authored entitled The Long Walk, The Planning Legacy of Howard University, Moorland-Spingarn Research Center, 1996, which traced the 127-year history of physical development of the campus. Hazel holds the Bachelor of Architecture from Howard University, the Master of Architecture and Urban Design from Harvard University, and the Ph.D. in Regional Planning from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Very impressive. She is a certified planner with the American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP, and was elected to their College of Fellows, FAICP. She has been a member of several American Institute of Architects and American Planning Association volunteer teams focused on developing alternatives to complex urban design, planning, community planning, and sustainable design assessment challenges. So with that, we're going to talk to Hazel. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so today, our focus of this podcast is about activism, addressing cultural and environmental threats in vulnerable communities. So first of all, I want to ask you, do you consider yourself an activist?
Well, it's interesting because I've never thought of myself as an activist. And so an activist to me is someone who brings about political or social change. We've certainly seen that in the past year, particularly in Georgia. And so, I don't think of myself that way. But I do view myself as more of an advocate and someone who defends or maintains a cause. I think throughout my academic career, which is now over 20 years of teaching, I've tried to be nurturing for the new generation of planning and design professionals, and so that they have this broad spectrum of cultural values with which there's this common thread of improving quality of life, livability for all citizens, but particularly for the vulnerable.
So how do you define vulnerable communities, and what cultural and environmental threats do you think exist for these communities?
I define vulnerable communities or populations rather as, African Americans, other people of color, indigenous people, women in particular, people who have been marginalized in one way or another, and those who are living in kind of intense probably isn't the right word, but in situations where their quality of life is negatively impacted. And so that could be, in terms of the cultural and environmental threats, it could be related to climate change and gentrification. And now the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've seen how uneven the response and impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. And so I think the broader implications, there are broader implications because vulnerable communities typically have higher health, economic, and other challenges that impact their resiliency and ability to withstand the different threats, environmental threats in particular. Just wanted to add that, poor environmental quality has been linked to poor health outcomes. There's also a correlation with income and particularly wealth gaps. But, the climate change today, the climate crisis, negatively impacts vulnerable populations that are juxtaposed between poor quality natural environments and limited resources to sustain healthy lifestyles. So, this is a contemporary challenge, climate change, but it's one that's heightened the already fragile state of communities of color. And those communities are disproportionately located in areas that have environmental hazards or limited resources. But, water quality, sea level rise, aging infrastructure, and the like are just some of the threats that I think that these communities will encounter. And I think that there's another aspect of this, and it deals with cultural shifts that may occur because of displacement and lack of affordability for housing in particular. And so, can we explore issues of injustice in the face of increasing gentrification? I know here in Washington, D.C., we have a shortage of affordable housing, but the residential construction, primarily multifamily units, is just so expensive that it's very difficult for young people in particular to acquire that housing. And then, in gentrified areas, and we're seeing it here in Washington, D.C., but I know it's happening across the country, that when a neighborhood is gentrified, the new residents often come in and have no regard for the memory of the historically Black areas or what the community used to be. And that we've seen even surrounding our campus that leads to conflicts that between racial and ethnic groups. So housing costs increase, people move from an area because they simply can't afford to live there anymore. That might also impact transportation costs, having to travel farther distances to places of employment. Honestly, I think new residents are moving in and they seem not to care about who lived there before or how they built the community.
So thank you so much for the depth and clarity of your answer to that question. The thing that you pointed out is that it's complex and it impacts, those populations that you mentioned in kind of a myriad of ways. So to follow up with that, I'd like for you to talk a little bit about how you address some of these or all of these or any of these issues within the work that you do.
So, now I'm an administrator, and so I don't do a lot of outside work, sadly. But when early in my academic career, actually just after I finished my Ph.D., I was asked to be a part of a research team on a project that was looking at quality of life in 25 communities in Indiana. And it was a way to kind of apply what I had learned in my training, my education, throughout my education. And so that project was something that I brought to the classroom when I started teaching later. But I've tried to guide students to think strategically about community challenges. And so they're not just looking at the present day condition of a community, but they're drilling down and understanding why it's that way. When I was at Morgan State, we worked in areas that had been negatively transformed by heavy drug activity, almost to the extent of kind of like Pied Piper lineups for drugs. And we were working specifically with a neighborhood association or a neighborhood community association, a group that was organizing and helping to bring about change in this particular neighborhood. And we in addition to making site visits and walking through the neighborhood, and I remember actually one of our first site visits, a resident came out and started talking to us, and she talked about how when she was growing up, you could literally eat off the streets, eat off the pavement in the alleys. And now, and she pointed to these overrun trash cans that were there for weeks, and debris was collecting elsewhere up against fences and the like. And she said, this is because the trash management had not come to wasn't effective in the neighborhood. And so regardless of how much they complained, the trash pickup services had not improved. And so, as part of that project, the students worked with different groups within the community, certainly adults, but I thought it was really important for us to talk to the youth in the community. And we brought them to campus and did, what we know as charrettes. And we asked them for, how do you depict your neighborhood in pictures? And then they had to, tell us what they saw or what was reflected in the drawings that they made. One of the kids, actually, he was a twin. He, had these outlines of buildings and these stick figures, people on the street. And so we asked, what are they doing? He said, well, they're the street pharmacists. And so, it was just, 11-year-old kind of feeling the pain, if you will, of how his environment was impacting him and his family was very, very significant to us. There was also a woman, young woman, 18 years old, who talked about drive-by shootings and the impact that had on her and her family. And so, we saw just kind of generally that in this area, there was a heavy drug activity, as I said, but there were also reduced economic opportunities and fractured support and amenities. And so, that also, there were no quality food sources. So no markets, no grocery stores, other ways of getting produce and other quality food, but plenty of unhealthy food options like the corner store that sold cigarettes, alcohol, and inexpensive yet food that had low nutritional value, and sometimes behind an inch of plexiglass. And so there was kind of this underlying social and cultural dynamic that was operating in a neighborhood that had few, if any, sit-down restaurants and places where people could engage with one another, with their communities outside of their homes. So we worked with this organization in particular to try to develop strategies for improving the quality of life in the area, or the livability of the area. And I think the youth, working with the youth, the young people, was really important to gain their views about what's happening now, but how things could improve in the future. So as an administrator, academic administrator, I think I now focus on securing resources and opportunities to support the faculty as they prepare our students to address community challenges. And unfortunately, that's kind of the extent of my the work that I do. Now it's helping others, the faculty and our partners, industry partners, to support our students so they can do the good work that's necessary. But when I got my Ph.D., I wanted to travel around the world to help people and communities improve their quality of life. And so, now again, I just try to help people to do that. And I just want to finally say that when I was studying urban design and regional planning, I almost never heard from my instructors how people of color positively impacted our communities. And so there was a lot of mention about having to do certain things for Black communities, minority communities, but not that, a person within that community was a community builder, community organizer, and a catalyst for change in their area. And that really struck me pretty hard. So by the time I started teaching, I wanted to make sure that there were diverse voices that were heard, that our students learned about what people who looked like them, who may have had shared experiences, were doing or had done in the community. And that means, knowing about, for women, knowing about Blacks and other women of color who are architects or landscape architects or designers. But I think, not hearing about, not having, it's not so much about role models, but knowing that others have paved the way for you. I think we've got to change that. And I think that also trickles down to the previous question about new residents coming into a community and not knowing or recognizing the history that it had.
That's so important because that's empowering, right? For communities or people in a community to know that others have done this. So if there's something I want to change, I can. And what you're doing as an administrator and as a professor, and which is rare. It's not a lot. I mean, if you look at the total numbers of African American, especially administrators, they're minuscule, and then even professors. So that's really important what you're doing. But I would also beg to differ with you that you're like a person who is well known across the country for your planning and urban design expertise. I mean, not that long ago, I participated with you on a regional urban design assistance team where they brought you in as an expert in Louisville, which is a very segregated place. And you can even think about the things that just happened there. And I was actually impressed with your application of, those planning and urban design skills as to what could really be done on the ground to change that community. So I would say that your skills and people, know you and think of you, and that's why they call you in to do those things. But not to diminish at all the groundbreaking position you have as being in your position at Howard University, a woman of color, probably the first woman of color in that position, and the empowerment you give to young women and young people of color that come there. Mm-hmm. And also the fact that you are doing this and people across the country know you for that. So,
well, I appreciate that. I am the first woman to head the chair, to be the chair of the Department of Architecture at Howard. And so I'm not sure whether this exhibit reached where you are teaching, but there's an exhibit that was circulating around the country called Built by Women. And so the backstory is that when I was a student, when I was studying architecture, I had one female professor. And I think across my 3 degrees and almost 10 years, 11 years of higher education, I probably had 5, if that many, female professors, and a couple of them were Black. But so to me, I've been really sensitive to, and so the other part of this is that our student population is over 60%, over 65%. And so we have to have women who are on the faculty, who are engaged with our students, the female students particularly, but we also need the male students to interact with female faculty. And I think we have changed the culture in our school, but certainly given our students this perspective that there are women who are achieving and excelling and doing things that they want to do.
That's so important. But just on a personal note, one thing I love about you, Hazel, is you're very gracious and so humble. It's amazing. But anyway, but I guess that's what makes you. You just do it. You don't have to know.
Thank you. I forgot. I got off track of why I mentioned that. So this Built by Women exhibit, like I said, it was circulating in the area, and maybe 35 panels that were divided by building type, so residential, institutional, and so forth. And all of these projects were projects that women architects had designed or been a part of the process. And I remember after we had gotten it up and displayed, there was a student who I think at the time was in her 2nd or 3rd year, and she said, "Thank you." I just happened to be walking by and she was looking at the panels. She said, "Thank you. we never hear about women. We never hear about female architects. And so this is so important.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's so true. Even in landscape architecture, we hear about of course, the Olmsted and the Halbrans and the Kiley, all men, and there have been women that have been doing these things. So it's important. You're a role model. So the last question I want to ask is, we're in really interesting times on many levels, as you talk, health, politics, all kinds of things, the climate, just all this. So what do you think, I guess, say like in the next 10 years, is the future? And what do you foresee as the future for these communities that, we deem vulnerable in light of the changes that are happening?
I think you're right that, this past year in particular has been so enlightening, challenging, yet enlightening. And I think that, unfortunately, with George Floyd's death or murder, and others who were Breonna Taylor and others who were murdered, this has been an awakening across the world, I believe. And so, one of the things that I think has come to light more so than in previous years, is this is just history repeating itself in some ways. But we're seeing the growing disparities in spatial, social, and environmental justice in communities of color are being daylighted. And so we're seeing, whereas we know that there have been zoning laws and other types of policies that have negatively impacted communities of color, we're actually seeing the impact that it's had on people who, the residents of those communities. And so I think these disparities do disproportionately impact low-income neighborhoods and particularly those in the inner city. And these are neighborhoods that have been, fractured by highway construction that literally divided neighborhoods so that the highway could connect. But urban renewal, government actions and policies of the 20th century, they're still impacting us. And so, one of the things that I think was really important back in the 70s was this collaboration to come together against environmental hazards. And so, again, those conditions were so dire that it wasn't just African Americans, but Latinos, Asians, Native American, Indigenous people, and others came together to fight environmental racism. And so I think with this recent Black Lives Matter peaceful protests across the country and frankly around the world, I think that this is showing us that when we work together, we can overcome different challenges. Georgia is a great example.
Yes.
So I think that we've got to find a way that happens kind of on the neighborhood level, happens more, that's promoted more at the neighborhood level, because I think that particularly with environmental issues, we're going to continue to see threats to vulnerable communities in terms of sea level rise. I mentioned before water quality. The infrastructure is deteriorating, and so how can we bring those issues, the impact of those different issues, to light? I remember when I first started teaching at Morgan State, I met someone in the planning department in the county, Baltimore County. He was the liaison between the county planning department and African American communities. And he told me that there was this one community that in 1999 was when I started teaching at Morgan. So in the 1990s, this community had no plumbing. They had no indoor plumbing. And how is that possible that people are living under those conditions? And so, how do we mobilize? How do we form partnerships? How do we work shoulder to shoulder in a community to make changes, to bring about change? I think that we as educators, particularly in the design disciplines, can reposition and recalibrate our pedagogical direction, because we should be about preparing. We are about preparing leaders who will be environmentally literate, culturally competent, socially engaged, and we're preparing them with the skills that they need to tackle these threats and extreme climate activities, events that we've even seen these past few weeks.
So that's really great, and that I know I said that was the last question, but forgive me. So then, in what you just said, how do you think HBCUs in particular can play a role?
Well, I think we've always been doing that work, the last thing that I said about preparing our students to bring about change and be those the catalyst for change or change agents or what have you. I know at Howard, we had a tradition that started in the 60s, late 60s, when we had a city planning program to train our students to become architect activists. And so I think that all of the design disciplines, architecture, landscape architecture, and planning, provide skills, teach our students to become critical thinkers. The design thinking process can be applied to a number of different situations. And so, bringing our skills, I think African Americans and people who are trained at historically Black colleges, there's 7 architecture programs at historically Black colleges and universities. And so, again, going back to what I said about preparing people to be culturally competent, I think that's part of the problem of some schools, that they're producing graduates who only know about suburban situations. They don't know about any other type of condition. And so I think we have to be, just as I often say, we've got to meet students where we find them in terms of their learning styles. And we've got to also understand the uniqueness of communities. And I believe that the HBCU programs, architecture programs, we have some shared experience with the communities and the people that we work with. And so I think that's going to be very important in improving the health of our communities.
That's so true, because it means a lot when designers, or even when you bring students in it, and there are people that look like them, right? It means a lot in terms of even empowering the community. So thank you so much, Hazel. I so appreciated this. This was really great, and I'm really happy because now other people will get to hear all about you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the invitation, and I hope that this will help somebody. My comments will help somebody.
It's inspiring. It'll inspire some young Black woman who'll say, "I'm going to be the next dean at Howard," or whatever. Anyway, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.